קודם כל אני רוצה לאחל לכולם ל"ג בעומר, חג שמח, וגם רמדאן כרים. ואני מוכן לקבל הערות גם בצ'אט, ואחר כך, אם יש לכם משהו לומר בקול רם, גם אפשר, ואתם יכולים באמצע ההרצאה לשאול שאלות, והשאלות יכולות להיות גם בעברית וגם באנגלית. But I will speak in English, and sometimes I'll throw in a couple Hebrew words, if that's okay with everyone. What I'm talking about today is the academic as a writer. And of course, the requirements in writing an academic paper differ by field, and you're coming from many different disciplines. And part of what you learn in your graduate studies is what the particular requirements are in your field, in your discipline, how strictly you have to keep to them, how journals differ, and so on. All that being said, there are many elements of writing that stretch across academic fields. And that's what I want to talk about today. Sometimes there'll be some things that will say that will not be immediately relevant for your field, but that's okay. And you can tell me about that in the questions if you like. And another thing I want to say about writing is that we also, as academics, share a lot with non-academic writers, journalists, novelists, nonfiction writers. These have a lot of elements that are very important for us to learn, and it's good to keep your ears open and to read broadly to see how people are presenting their work, because they can teach us an awful lot. So it's important to think of yourself not only as a researcher, but also as a writer. That is, you are communicating your findings, your analysis, what innovations you have to bring to your field. You have to communicate them in as effective a manner as possible. I think I said last time, and I think I'll repeat it, that I see writing as two things. I'll come back to the first, which is writing is the act of thinking. And the second is that writing is the act of persuasion. That is, you are trying to influence others, to accept others, to make others accept what you're trying to do, to persuade your fellow academics, to persuade the grant givers to give you money, to persuade journal editors to publish your piece, to persuade your supervisor to finally let you get out of graduate school. These are all very important. So writing is the act of persuasion, and it is essential that you see it that way, not simply as the presentation of your research. And I'll talk more about that. So let me talk about the 2 or 3 key elements that have to go into every piece of writing that you do, into every journal article, into every grant proposal. The first is that every effective piece of writing has at its base, at its foundation, a question. That question doesn't have to be explicitly stated, but it has to be very clearly implied, and often it is explicitly stated. And that question, and you've heard this many times, is a why question. It begins with the word why and not how. And the reason for that is that a question that begins with how tends to lead you into a descriptive kind of presentation. And the questions that begin with why tend to be analytic. And by analytic, I mean why? Because. And that allows you to develop an argument, a because, an argument that is key. And it's very important that that question be extremely clear and that it grabs the reader. If you're writing a grant proposal, you want that person who is judging the 300 grant proposals in front of her, you want that person to be saying, oh, that's interesting. I wonder why that is too. And I'll come back to how you do that in a moment. I'll just say a word that I had a conversation yesterday with my granddaughter, Mirav, and she asked, why don't airplanes fall from the sky? And I thought that was a perfect kind of example of a research question that really it's not so clear. Everything else, material, non-animate, if you put it up high, it falls down. And airplanes don't. And so she wanted to know why they don't. And that's precisely the kind of question that will grab the attention, grab my attention anyway as a Saba, but it'll grab others' attention as well. So the essential element in asking this question is drama. Every paper, whether it's a scientific paper, Madei Ruach, Madei Chevra, Madei Teva, lo chashuv, it has to have a dramatic element to it. And the question is, because it's the dramatic element, the tension that exists in drama, the kind of when we see a play, who did it? Who was the killer? Was it the butler? The same kind of thing in a scientific presentation. Oh, that's an interesting question. There's a tension there. Why is it that way? Why does it exist that way? So how do you create drama? What sorts of questions increase the drama and therefore increase the likelihood that someone will continue to read your proposal or your paper or whatever you're writing? And it starts in my mind with the notion that the world is a bizarre place, okay? The world is strange, muzar ma'od. And it is the strangeness of the world, the strangeness in, for example, why every object but an airplane falls from the sky to the ground, that strangeness of it, the bizarre quality that only one thing doesn't fall, is what lies at the heart of any good paper. So let me give you a couple of examples here, just off the top of my head. In social science, we might think, for example, that in the century, from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, France and Germany fought a number of brutal wars. The War of 1870, World War I, World War II. Tens of thousands of them were killed. The hatred between the peoples of Germany and France, you can still feel to this day, okay? And yet suddenly, in 1954, the leaders of France and Germany agree to give up part of their sovereignty and create an international organization that will, in many ways, govern parts of their society, the so-called coal and steel community, which later became, a lot later became the European Union. Now that's bizarre. Why did these mortal enemies, these countries that are at each other's throats, all of a sudden give up sovereign powers to become buddies and partners in the new Europe? Let me give another example. This one is from Madei Teva. So there's in South America, the biggest river in the world flows. It is the Amazon River. And like other rivers in that part of South America, it flows from west to east into the ocean. But geologists found that in the past, the Amazon River flowed in the opposite direction, from east to west. That's bizarre. That is strange. How and why did a river change directions? So it's precisely that kind of question that really is at the heart of an effective paper, one that grabs your reader, whether it's a scientific reader or a general reader, grabs your reader and says, and the reader says to himself, wow, I wonder, that's strange, it changed direction. How did that happen, right? And through both anecdotes and hard evidence, you have to establish the veracity of your question. I'm going to come back to the question of anecdotes. I'm going to come back to evidence a little bit later, but it's very important for you to gain credibility that the question is a real question and it's not something just out of your head, and that it's something that the person reading would like answered. So even before you give the empirical proof, you often want to start your paper, and I'll come back to this, with an anecdote, which is a story. A little story that is one, it proves nothing, but it immediately grabs the reader and says, oh, that story really reflects a larger question, and I'd like to know the answer to that. So that's what I call the first question of the paper. The second question any paper has to ask, and this includes grant proposals, goes like this. All right, I'm asking a question about the Amazon River. I'm obviously not the first person to ask this question, why a river might change direction. Others have asked it. And if they haven't asked that question explicitly, they've asked broader questions that I would be able to understand the flow of rivers from. So either through directly tackling the question that you have, or through a general explanation that can let us extrapolate the answer to my specific question, other people have asked your question already. There's no doubt about it. So your second question is, why are they wrong? Why are the existing explanations inadequate? And that's very important, because if they successfully answered your question, then there's no reason for you to do your research. We have the answer to your question already. Why do we need your paper? We need your paper only if you can show that the existing literature is inadequate, wrong, needs modification, only applies to some cases and not others, and is basically wrong in its essence. Now, I think that that is the best way to bring in what everybody calls the literature, okay? I think that a boring literature review is exactly that. It's boring if you just go through all the literature on a topic. Rather, you want to structure that literature by carefully examining what others have given as an answer to your question. Now, someone wrote me that the recording is not working again, so let me try again. I don't know why. No, it says it is. So
it is working.
Okay. Okay. So I am opposed, I don't know, others will not agree with me on this, to giving literature reviews, but rather to structure the literature in terms of, here are the answers that have been given to my specific question or to the more general question that my research reflects, and here is why they are wrong. And that is very important. Now, there are a couple things here. First, you must be very respectful of these other answers. You're taking people who are serious. The more serious the people you take to show that they've given answers that are wrong, the more your credibility increases. If you just take some Joe Schmo who is not very important, so what? But if you take key people, you must be respectful of them. They are serious. They are leading people in the field. And you must analyze them very carefully. All too often in papers or dissertations or in grant proposals, what we see is people dismiss existing answers in one sentence. Oh, this doesn't take such and such into account. That's not good enough. Really, what you have to do is analyze the chain of logic and evidence in the existing answers and show the broken link in the chain where that explanation goes wrong. Okay? Why it's incomplete, why it's inadequate. And you don't have to do that for everyone in the field. You don't need to cite everyone. You have to cite the central people who everyone who reads on this topic will say, oh yeah, those are the people who are at the center of the conversation about whatever your topic is. And they're the people who are offering answers. And this guy is going to show me that they're really inadequate or they're wrong. Okay. So the first question that I asked, the one about why don't airplanes fall from the sky, or why did the Amazon change directions, or why did France and Germany suddenly start kissing each other? That question is what I call the empirical question. And the second question, the one I just was talking about, is the theoretical question. Now, the first question, the empirical question, should be clear to almost anyone with a basic knowledge of your field. I used to talk to my students about passing my mother's test. Now, my mother never even graduated high school. She was a very smart woman, but she didn't have an opportunity to go to school. And she would ask me each day, what did you do today? And I would say, well, I talked to a graduate student, yes. What is that person writing on? And I would tell her the empirical question. And if she said, whoa, that's interesting. That really is interesting, why airplanes don't fall from the sky, why the Amazon changed direction. Then they passed my mother's test because she was intrigued. If, on the other hand, she would say, as she often did, so what? That's not interesting. Then they hadn't passed the test. And so you could use your mothers or your children or whoever you have handy. It doesn't matter if this is Madei Teva, Madei Chevra, Madei Ruach. This should be a question that an intelligent lay person should be able to be intrigued by. Wow, that is question. And that first empirical question structures your paper, not the theoretical. Don't ever start with what the literature says, where there are 5 to 10 people in your field who may be interested in some esoteric question. Start with the broader empirical question, and then you move. I'll talk about how you do that. Then you move to the theoretical question. Once you've done that, you have to have an answer to the question, right? And here I want to caution you a little bit about something. In the social sciences and humanities particularly, but also Madei Teva, there are multiple answers to any good question. You could make a list of 20 answers. And there are political scientists, for example, in my field. I'm thinking I can name names here. You remember David Peter Cowie? Peter Cowie would write a paper. He would ask a very good question, and then he would say, here are the 19 answers to this question. I really took issue with Cowie, and I told him, this is not a good way to write a paper. Why? Because you want to write your paper in such a way that when someone who reads it and then talks to a friend of theirs, and the friend says, what'd you do today? Oh, I read David's paper. Oh, really? What's the question? Question is, the Amazon River changed direction sometime in history. Instead of going west to east, it went east to west, and or it was the opposite. And he wants to know why. And the friend says, "Wow, that's fantastic. That's a great question. What does he say? What's the argument?" And you then say, well, I can't reproduce the whole argument. It was like 19 different reasons that it changed direction. I can't specify. That's a failure of a paper. And it's not going to get you a grant application. It's not going to get you a journal placement. And at least for the supervisors I know, they're not going to be happy either. You have to have an answer that is synthetic and that is easily transmitted so that the reader can say, aha, the reason that they give in the paper is X, okay? So what do you do here? If there are many answers, but you have to give one answer, how do you handle the writing in this process? So part of the research, especially looking at the secondary literature, is to assemble as many answers as you can. Make a list. If they're 19, if they're 10, if they're 7, whatever, make a list, okay? But what do you do then? You then take each answer, put it on a little Post-it, little piece of paper, go into your shower and put it on the wall of your shower, okay? And as you take a shower, you look at all these pieces of paper. Try not to wash them away and begin to move them around. Begin to see if they fit into particular clusters, okay? And then you have a particular moment. That moment has a technical name. It's called the aha moment. Aha. You synthesize some of those answers, including your own original research, into an answer that is innovative and original and that can be apprehended quickly by someone reading the paper. It's obviously going to have a lot of subparts. It's going to be lots of complications to it that you're going to add. It's going to have subvariables and sub-subvariables. That's okay. But the entire answer of a synthesized, presentable answer that someone can grasp in a minute has to be available in your writing. That's what makes a powerful argument. And if you think, in my field, of some of the best books in the field by people like, I don't know, Barrington Moore or anybody, Samuel Huntington, anyone, you could take books that they have that are 500 pages long, and you can say in a sentence or two what their argument is, okay? So the synthesis doesn't have to include all those pieces of paper on your shower wall. You can throw away some of those answers. That means that you could put them in footnotes and say, look, I'm only explaining 30% or 40% of the variance. If you can do that in the social sciences, you're a hero. And I'm not going, there are other things at hand. I mean, you put them in the footnotes, but you're going to concentrate on one. Let me give you an example here to return to our case of the Amazon River. So there are many reasons why the Amazon River historically changed directions. One example is someone hypothesized that changes in convection within the Earth's mantle drove this. Okay. Others thought it resulted from the breakup of Africa and South America in prehistoric times. Okay. There's one guy, Dr. Victor Sacek, a Brazilian, and he demonstrated that he can explain a lot of the variance by looking at the question of erosion. Because of the tremendous water flow in the Amazon River and the nature of soil sediments, he was bringing to evidence that it is the accumulated erosion that caused the changing of the direction of the Amazon River. Now that's a powerful answer, okay? And don't be afraid to give contrary evidence. Not all the evidence is going to fit, okay? So Dr. Sacek, for example, says that his model, quote, fails to fully reproduce the spatial and temporal evolution of the Phoebus system as observed in geological data. In other words, his model doesn't work entirely, but he's giving a kind of tentative answer. He's not unafraid to give the contradictory evidence. You can do that. In fact, it increases your credibility to say, look, there are some things that are problematic here. There are issues that are problematic. Which gets me to the issue, maybe I'll stop here for a second and ask if anybody has a question. And you can unmute yourself or write it in the chat. And I'll take a drink. No? Okay. So this brings me to the issue of credibility. Every writer has to establish his or her credibility. That is, that people are going to believe you. This is as true of a fiction writer as it is of somebody writing in Madei Teva. I know one of the things I've been doing at home, sitting here day after day, is I'm taking a class on the stories of Agnon. And we read one story yesterday, and someone said, you know, that's not credible. What he's saying is not credible. Now, he's writing fiction. He's making it up, but he's making up a world in which you have to believe that that world exists and that there's a logic to that world. Even more so in the sciences, social sciences, and humanities, you must make people believe you, right? It must make people believe you. And there are a few ways to do that. First, you have to establish, and I think this is particularly true in the social sciences and humanities, you have to establish that you personally are a credible person, that you are to be believed. And if you look at good articles, they will establish that I spent 6 months doing this research, I went to these archives, I've written other pieces on this. They give a kind of mini biography right in the middle of the article in order to establish their own credibility, that people will believe them. And that is important. It's important in a grant application, it's important in an article. The second thing, obviously, is you have to be very careful about elucidating your methodology. That is, you have to show how you handled the evidence, how you collected the evidence, how you analyze that evidence, that the methodological part is something that is transparent and is something that they can check for you. And let's see here. Yeah. And the third is obviously the one I won't even speak about. You have to have strong empirics. That is, your evidence has to be very strong. And that's something you already know. So let's talk about, okay, so can I repeat the point about methodology? And the answer is yes. You must, in your article or grant proposal or dissertation, must make clear how you collected your data and how you analyzed it. What kinds of techniques, statistical or qualitative techniques, or other techniques you used in order to do this. And this must merely be clear to the reader so that the reader can say, yeah, that sounds like the way you should do it. Otherwise, your credibility falls. Oh, this seems sloppy. It's not clear to me how this person got the data. I'll give you an example that, and maybe I shouldn't give. I just read an article, and it was on China, and it was sort of asking people very sensitive questions that in an authoritarian country like China, you would think would really not be kosher. And the authors in this case explained their methodology. And I wrote back to someone said, what did you think of that article? And I wrote back and I said, you know what? I don't believe it. I don't believe those people answered honestly. They're putting themselves at risk. I don't think this is good data. I don't think the data really doesn't convince me at all. In other words, they didn't establish their credibility for me. Kevin asks, do I recommend presenting all the 19 answers after you synthesize your argument? No, I don't think you need to give all 19, or you could give a long footnote in which you talk about the ones that you haven't employed in your own answer, but I don't think you have to discuss all 19 by any means. And מה לגבי כותבים לא מפורסמים שהשיבו לשאלה שלי אבל אחרים לא התייחסו אליהם? Well, you know, look, you're writing, you would love to get אנשים מפורסמים to react to you, but I don't think that's your main question here. Your main thing is this something that if that person who was famous read it, that person would say, whoa, that's a good question. I really hadn't thought about that. Or that's a good objection to my work. That's what you're aiming for here. So let me say a few words on writing the paper itself. First of all, something I alluded to earlier, writing is not the process of putting what is already in your head on paper. That's not what writing is. You don't say, oh, I have it all. I've done all the analysis in my head. I've thought it through. Now I'll just write it down on paper. That's not what writing is. Writing is the act of thinking. You must let what you write talk to you. You have to have an interactive relationship with what's on the paper. And that's why many people often step away from what they have written for a couple of days, because if they do it immediately, they can't build that the writing as a subject that they're interacting with. You step back and you've forgotten it a little and you say, now, does that make sense? Is it placed well? Does the argument come through? Is there something wrong here? You let the paper talk to you. The other thing about writing is, how do you structure this? And this may differ by field, and certainly some journals have specific guidelines on how to structure your paper, but let me just talk generally about that. It is often very effective to lead off your paper with a little story, with a powerful anecdote, some little piece of evidence that you found in the lab that behaved strangely, or something in the archives that just didn't make sense to you. How is that possible? Or something that you found in the field that seems to contradict, one village was one way, one village was another way, and one village in one of the most famous books in historical sociology is where two villages in southern France, very close and very similar, were one saved the Jews in the Holocaust and the other gave up the Jews in the Holocaust. And immediately the question is, well, why? That's strange. How come these two villages are so similar? So if you want to discuss the kind of responses to the Holocaust, you might start off with those two villages, or you might start off with a person or two people or a little piece of evidence. That anecdote or story that you start right at the beginning of the paper humanizes or simplifies what's going to be a complicated and deep paper, and it should have embedded in it, don't just start with any story, have a story that has embedded in it the why question you want to ask, the bizarre, strange thing that is going to drive your paper. Often that is exactly what hooks a reader. I can't emphasize enough that there's too many articles out there, too many grant proposals to read, there's too much to read, and every academic makes choices. And one of the ways they make choices is reading the first page of an article, reading the abstract and the first page. And that first page has to grab them. It has to immediately be something and say, whoa, well, what's going on here? Let me give you an example, an anecdote that I made up. Scientists had clear archaeological evidence of the existence of pre-humans, like Lucy. You've heard of Lucy, found in Africa. Those pre-humans lived, according to the dating and carbon dating, about 3.2 million years ago. The scientists also had archaeological evidence of actual humans beginning maybe 2.3 million years ago, about 1 million years later. And then one day, an Ethiopian student, Chalachu Seyum, found a jawbone in Ethiopia, and it wasn't as developed as the human artifacts that they had found 2 million years ago, nor was it so primitive as the pre-humans 3 million years ago. So he thought, wow, this is strange. What do I have here? What do I have here, right? And from that, he was able to develop a broader theory of human evolution that connected the pre-humans to the humans, he and others he was working with. So that kind of an anecdote, the story of this student digging up this jawbone and looking at it, this immediately gets the attention of the reader. It captures the reader. And then you follow that with the broader question, right? So after a brief introduction that has the anecdote, a very truncated version of the broader question that you're asking and what you're going to argue, you then go into the first substantive part of the paper, and that is your question. You give the evidence that this question is credible, is real, that you've really found something bizarre and interesting, and what's going on. That maybe will take up 30% of your paper, although it's not a set formula. Then you follow the next section is, well, people have tried to answer this. This is what we talked about before, the second question. Why does the literature get it wrong? And here's where you do your analysis of the existing literature and the chain of reasoning and why certain links are broken. Then the next part of the paper, you give your empirical answer. That is your synthesis, your great answer, your argument, right? And finally, you return back to the theory and you ask, okay, look at my answer. Now let's look back at the theory again. What went wrong there? How do I have to modify, change the theory? And that's your theoretical contribution. So there are some pitfalls in writing. Often people take way too long to get to their question. They give a lot of background. By the way, the same is true in job interviews. I've seen people give introductions to their research presentation that go on for half an hour and totally bore people. People want you to get to the substance. That's true in writing too. And as I said, people don't commit right away to read everything you've written or your grant proposal or your article. They want to know immediately, is this worth going on? And do not, another pitfall, do not frame your work as filling in a gap. Others have shown A, and some others have shown C, and I'm going to show B. That's boring. It does not excite the reader. It is not a way to develop a kind of hook, as we say, to grab your reader and make that reader go on. Finally, and then I'll go to some of these questions that are beginning to come in. If you are submitting a proposal, an article, in a language that is not your mother tongue, in other words, if you're a native Hebrew speaker or Arabic speaker, and you are submitting your paper to a journal or to a grant, a foundation in English, you must use an editor. It is, no matter how good your English is, there are going to be issues of syntax and grammar that, and I can tell you, having tried to write something in Hebrew and it's a mess, you must use an editor. I know this is expensive. I know it's difficult, but you don't want to get rejected or people to turn off because I can't follow what this person is saying, right? So you must use an editor. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to look at some of the questions on the chat and then also take any questions you have out loud. Do you recommend using metaphors, stories, or objective style of writing? I definitely recommend using metaphors and stories, but they can't be everything, right? You have to use the story as a way to make your reader want to read on, but then you're going to need an objective analysis, meaning strong evidence in a systematic way. האם למעשה יש בעיניך שתי שאלות לגבי כל מאמר, תיאורטית ואמפירית, אז מה היחס ביניהם? Yeah, I think that, I don't know, I don't want to say every article has, but I think that practically every article will have both questions. It's going to have the question of, why does the world work like that? Isn't that strange? And the second question is, why, in explaining why the world works like that, do the existing theories fail? Those are your two questions, and that is the relationship between them. The second question is an attempt to answer your first question through the literature or theory or existing theories and showing why those theories fail. Kindly explain again what will be a better way to write than filling in the gap. Well, Ariel, I would say, yeah, I think you just don't have to think, you have to think in a different frame. You have to think not as filling in the gap so much as jump back to your empirical question. Ask what is strange here? What is strange going on? There's no reason to fill in B if we can extrapolate B from A and C. If it behaves exactly like A and C, there's no reason to do it. In other words, if we have a study of, I don't know, a village, and it behaves in a certain way, and somebody else has done another study in a similar village, and it's also gets the same results, it's not interesting then to go to a third village and do the same question. The B would only be interesting if it is behaving differently from A and C. You fill in the gap not in just doing another case, but in showing how that case highlights difficulties in trying to give a general answer to A and C that just doesn't work for B. That's how I would do it.
So my question is like that, if the field that, or the question that I'm asking is something that people have studied or scholars were checking, not in a way that I was even, that the way that I'm looking at, meaning they were looking at that from the right of that to the left of that, but not right on it. So how would you, in that case, build the way that you were describing to us, your first question and your second, mainly your second one?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. It's a question of classification, right? You're saying, look, somebody I asked this question, somebody gave an answer, and the answer doesn't work, the second question I asked, and you say it doesn't work because they're not looking at exactly the same thing. They're looking at different cells or different molecules or different samples or whatever it is. And so part of your answer for why their explanation doesn't work is because you're building a classification system in which you show, aha, it doesn't work here. It only works there. And that will help you develop your second question. Does that give you an adequate answer?
Kind of. So,
Okay.
not fully.
Okay.
I mean, maybe if we think of your airplane example, right? And
Yeah.
someone asking, why do birds fly? I mean, a lot of scholars checked out why do birds fly,
Right.
and others maybe check the concept of flying in general. I don't know.
Right.
Sometimes
Right.
just trying to tie to that example of yours. And I'm wanting to ask, or in my example, the second one would be they checked about this vehicle called airplanes. I want to put together the concept of flying and this machine called airplane and say, why do airplanes now fly? Meaning I'm taking two domains that were lots of scholars have done on both, but now I'm combining them, and this is new.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So, okay, again, it's a good question, and I see you now. Okay. Look, part of what you're trying to do is ask a big question, right? Through your specific research. You're trying to answer a big question. Everybody has to have a big question. You don't want something that is so narrowly focused that it's of little interest to almost anyone. You're then going to say, look, there are some answers to this big question, okay? And here they are, but I'm looking specifically at airplanes. And these questions, these answers that exist out there really can't explain that. They can explain birds, they can explain helicopters, but they can't explain airplanes. So their theories are on the question of why things can fly. Their answer is inadequate. It doesn't mean they're wrong about the birds, but it's inadequate. It's not a general enough answer. And what you're going to do is attack that and show that there's a broader answer, that if you look at airplanes, you're going to find the theory needs to be broadened.
thank you. That helped.
Hi, I have one question.
Yeah.
You see me?
Yeah, I see you.
Yes, I'm Maram. I'm PhD student in law school. So thank you. It's very interesting. It helps a lot. You've spoken generally, and you have said in the beginning that each field does have its own rules. So what's different between law school or social? Can you please tell us more about this? And the other question is about the last stage in the structure. You've said that after explaining what is my argument, I should return back to the theory. Can you tell us more about this stage, the last one?
Yeah. So on the first question, how do fields differ? First of all, you'll see that when you submit to certain journals, they may demand a particular structure to your presentation. For example, some of them have evidence, discussion, analysis, and so on. And they want you to follow that outline, and that's fine. I think you can still do what I said within those parameters. You're just going to have to be a little inventive. But it is true also that fields differ. Law, for example, I don't know much about law, but I know something. Law, for example, demands tremendous attention to footnotes in law journal articles that I've seen, tremendous attention, much more than social science would demand, I think. It demands a particular relationship to precedent. And those you have to take into account of whether they're going to just throw it out because you have broken the form. But I think everything I said you can still do within the parameters of law journals, scientific journals, and others. Now, as far as the last thing goes, you were asking, in writing the paper, you have to come back to the theory. What you've really done in the early part of the paper is show that the theory is inadequate, right? It doesn't, when I look at airplanes, it doesn't work. It works for birds, it works for helicopters, it doesn't work for airplanes. So, and the theory is a theory of flying, and so that theory is inadequate. That's what you've done in the first part, and you've just left it at that. After you give your answer, you say, now let's return to this question of the theory of flying. What can we do with that theory that will now incorporate birds, helicopters, and airplanes? How are we going to make that theory work? Or maybe you say it can't work, and here is a new theory of flying, right? So what you're trying to do there is to come back to the second question that you asked, the theoretical question, and try and give an answer to it. Try to modify the existing literature in a way that the specialists will say, whoa, that's interesting. This person has really brought a new dimension to the theory that hadn't been there before.
Thank you.
Let me go back for a second to some of these on chat. How do you decide how much to elaborate the methodology? I just read a 52-page article with elaboration that was exhausting. Yeah, it's a very good question, because in all these things, you're playing a balancing game between the space limitations that you have. Usually journals will not allow 52-page articles. They usually allow articles that are much less than that, and the social sciences generally about 35 pages. And so it's a balancing act to be as thorough as you can on all parts, not only the methodology, but also on your empirical evidence and on the both developing the question and the argument. You have to have a balance so that you are convincing and credible. And I don't think I can't give you a simple formula. I wish I could, but it is, in books, what people often do is say, you can skip this chapter, which is on methodology, and go to the substance if you're not interested in methodology. You can't do that in an article, but I think you have to be, I would say, at least a page or two in which you're elaborating, here's the evidence, and this is why this is good evidence, and here's what I did with this evidence. I would think a page or so at least. What else here? If you point to a consensus that is problematic and you are offering a counter argument, is that considered filling the gap? No, that's not what I mean by filling the gap. Filling the gap, I mean simply replicating other pieces with a new case that really does not develop the theory at all. is there a way to go beyond the numbers? You asked this, Kevin. Yeah, I think you have to. And look, numbers, both in the social sciences and in the hard sciences, are very important. There's no doubt about them. But you must humanize them, and if possible, problematize them. That is, when you look at a person, a story, a small group, even though you have a huge number, what you're trying to do is saying, let's look beyond those numbers. Let's look behind the scenes to see what's going on here. What are the mechanisms? How are people dealing with this? And that's often messy, but I think it's very powerful. Let's see here. Moise asks, part of my thesis is reviewing philosophy of mind. What is the methodology? I mean, I am reading and reviewing and will compare, contrast, what is methodology here? Oh, well, okay, I don't deal with methodology of the mind, but I would say your data are texts. I think, Moise, am I right that when you say philosophy of mind, you're thinking philosophy of thinkers?
Correct.
And your
Correct.
data, is that right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, so your data are the thinkers' pieces, the actual texts that you are using, and you have to explain, convince your reader. It's very important in qualitative work like yours. It's very important to give the reader confidence that how you are reading and comparing those texts or those thinkers or those minds. That is very important. How you do it, I don't do philosophy of mind, but
okay, fine, thank you.
you're welcome. Let's see what else here. Hold on. All right, this is from Kadit. Where are you, Kadit? I don't see you. What if my question is huge and interesting, but I answer only a small, very specific bit of it, and I am not sure I am answering the most important part? I answer the more easily answerable part. How do I present my empirical question? The big or the specific? Should I ask the question? Should I answer the question? Okay, look, that's what all of us do. Exactly what you're doing. We ask very big questions, you know. How does the world work? Physicists are asking huge questions about the forces of nature, right? And then they are going to look at a very small, specific experiment that they may undertake. And they are, through that, they are hopefully going to see some contradiction between the larger big theories and what they're finding on their very small case. And therein lies what's interesting to your reader. It's not your very, very small case that's of interest, not a village in medieval France that's of interest. I remember my very first conference I went to, somebody was giving a paper, that's why I gave that example, on medieval France, a village in southern France. And somebody raised his hand and said, how do we know that you picked the right village? Now, that's a really good question, because no one is really interested in that specific village in France in the year 1300. What we're interested in is, does this explain some broader forces that were changing the world at that time? And through this particular village, are you going to show me how those forces are changing? So the relationship between the very specific and the general is really key in your writing, because people are not going to be so interested in the specific. They will be very interested in how that reflects on the general.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just so I asked, ouch, sorry, that's why I was muted, because my dog keeps barking.
Okay.
Sorry. But so you said that like 30% should go to the empirical question. And when you mean the empirical question, you mean the big one or the specific one?
The empirical question, well, okay, that's a very good question. It's really both. It's the specific one. It is why did the Amazon River change directions, right? Which is also implying a much bigger question. How do we understand the movement of rivers in the world, right? Or how do we understand geological history in that sense? But it's your specific question that you really want to elaborate there.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Maram, did you say something?
Yes, what's the quantity, the percent for the specific question? 50%? I didn't hear.
Developing the question, I gave a number, but I don't want to, this is not a set formula. I said about 30%. Usually in my field, I would say that about 30% is on developing and proving the question. And the rest is developing answer and theory. Now, let me just say, I've read books. There's a famous political scientist, Robert Putnam. He stated his question on the very first sentence of his book, and that was it. He said, that was it. I mean, he gave a little bit of evidence, and it was, the rest of the book was the argument. So it varies, but usually you have to develop that question to convince your reader, did the Amazon River really change direction? How do you know? This was, millions and millions of years ago. Why should I believe you that the Amazon River changed directions? So you really have to give the evidence to show that that really happened and it really is bizarre. Anything else?
Can you tell us more about editing work? Like, I think most of us are not native speakers, and more about editing work. Like, not all editors do the same quality of work, and some do also more, not language editing, but even more, like help you to structure differently.
Right. Okay. All right. There are different kinds of editors. Some editors are general editors who edit for content. Is your argument making sense? Did you structure it well? Do you contradict yourself at various points? There are should you be structuring this very differently? All kinds of big questions like that. At this point, I would say you don't need editors like that. What you need, and I said this in the last lecture I gave to the graduate students, was you need a reading group, you need some friends, and you need to exchange papers. Not a reading group, but a writing group where you exchange papers and you say to your friends, look, does this make sense? Is it grabbing you? Is the argument being developed clearly? Is the question clear? Does it get all muddled? One big argument that happens, I just read a really good novel. It was a novel. It was a really interesting novel on South Korea. And my sister read it, and my sister said, the author got lost in the weeds. Now that's an expression which means that the author started to tell so much detail that you forgot what the general question and general answer are, okay? And this your friends can help you with. You don't need a professional editor. I know you're all on limited budgets. Get a writing group in which you exchange papers with each other and you honestly say, look, I didn't follow this. You're too much detail here. You have to cut the methodology part. It's too long. People lose interest. This is what your friends are for. And if you can get your supervisor to read it, that too. What the editor I was talking about is usually called a copy editor. And it's the last thing. You finish the paper. It's clear now. You think you're pretty happy with it. and you say to the editor, look, I want this clean. I want it clean for syntax. Syntax means word order and the way things are expressed, and grammar. That's what I need from you. And you can get editors, there are a lot of them in Israel, who can do that for you. It just costs money. Maybe David has some suggestion on where to find money. Some people noted here you should use Grammarly. Okay, very limited. I mean, that'll help a little bit. It's not going to help a lot, and it's not going to help you much with syntax. But it does help. You should use that tool in your word processing program. Let's see here. Can I elaborate on the second question, the theoretical one? What should guide our questions in this area? How is it done? And how to examine a clear and relevant conduct in the theory part? You know, in the theory part, there is a, you know, not everybody agrees with me, and you can ask your own supervisors here. I tell my students, you don't have to bring in everybody. Your field is a series of concentric circles. And by that I mean, at the center are the most important works in the field that really set the tone. They're cited by everyone. And then circles in which some things are cited, and then out on the very outside in which people really don't pay much attention. You want to find the concentric circle, the one in the middle. That is the most important people and most important ideas that seem to be governing the way people think about your topic, okay? And it's those people that you want to take on. It may only involve 2 or 3 different alternative theories for what you're doing. And it doesn't have to be comprehensive. But at that point, you want to identify those people and give them their due. Read them carefully. Why is this not, and maybe it's explaining rivers in Europe and Asia, but it's not explaining the Amazon. Look at my case, it can't explain it. That's what you're trying to do there. You're trying to find where those theories fail you, fail in you answering your empirical question. Let's see, what else do we have here? Do you have some tips to write an abstract? You know, I'm really not good at abstracts, so I don't have great tips, but what you want to try and do there is quickly, in a sentence or two, give the context of what you're studying, give the central question that you're asking, and give a brief hint as to what your answer is going to be. And that's about it. Anything else?
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Hi.
This is
Einat.
Yeah.
I just want to circle back for a second about the editors, the copy editors. What's the best way to pick an editor? Because, well, even copy editors, they're good ones, and then there's so-so ones.
Yes.
And and I've seen someone pay a lot of money for very so-so work. So that's kind of
yeah, and that I don't have a real good answer for you other than your professors. What department are you in that?
I'm a medieval historian. So
medieval
Department of
historian. Oh,
History.
you like my example of the French medieval?
I did.
Good. Your professors have used such editors, and you want to get people that others have found to be really effective. You have to do it on reputation. And if some of your fellow students have used, oh, somebody's really good, oh, somebody I paid a lot of money really didn't do the job, you have to do it by reputation. I don't think there's any other way to do it.
And is it better to have an editor that specializes, say, in history or art history, or so on, or do you think that's not as
No,
important?
I don't think so. One of the editors I know here in Israel is a woman who's worked many years. I don't know if she's still doing it or not, but she worked in the Tel Aviv University engineering department and edited the papers for the engineers there. And she had no background in science or engineering at all, but it was to make their English really, really clear.
Okay.
I just say, you know, I said this, I don't know how many of you were in my last talk when I talked about, what did I talk about? In building an audience, right? One of the key elements of writing, it seems to me, is to be very careful to get as broad an audience as you possibly can. And that means using language that is accessible, using language that not only the very few specialists in your field will understand. Now, sometimes that involves a compromise because jargon has a use, right? Jargon is used because it is very, very specific and has clear definitions. I lean towards using looser but clearer language so that a broader audience can access what you're writing. You know, in your case, Einat, you want to make sure your family can read this and find it interesting.
They find it interesting. They don't necessarily find it easy to read, but yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
I'm just driving and I'm listening to you and I'm enjoying every minute. But I wanted to ask you if there's any way you concentrate in defining the empirical and the theory question regarding different kinds of research, like qualitative versus quantitative.
Well, if you're asking, is the basic process the same? I think it's exactly the same. If you're doing quantitative research, you're still going to want to ask, what are the theories that have tried to encapsulate what I have found quantitatively? And similarly qualitative. I found X, Y, and Z in my qualitative research on medieval. What country are you doing medievally, Einat?
I'm working on late medieval mysticism and lived experience in England and Italy.
Mysticism, wow. Okay, so
that's why it's hard.
Yeah, so if you're doing qualitative research, there are people who have written about mysticism. Many of them are here in Israel, right? And they have explanations for what you're trying to, whatever your question is. And I don't think there's a real difference between qualitative and quantitative research in asking the theoretical question that I.
Okay. First, I see that there's another Einat, so nice to meet you, Einat.
Yeah, I think that you asked the wrong Einat about the medieval history stuff. It's
no, I was asking you.
Me?
Know,
oh yeah.
Okay, I didn't know the other Einat. What does the other Einat work on?
My name is Einat Ben-Dov. I'm doing a study. Actually, my PhD is in disability studies, and 1.5 years ago, I came back from California. I studied at a small university, Chapman University in Orange County. So I'm doing a qualitative research, and I was not really thinking all the time that I have two questions. Actually, the theoretical is embedded, of course, inside the research, but I was not really thinking that I have to think about another question, which I think it's right now after listening to you, and maybe it's making me more focused. Because I'm doing a study about student veterans with disabilities in Israel. There's no research about it. But in the United States, in the recent years, there's a few research about it, and a few PhD students that involve some new theories in the fields. So I was not really appointing theory as a question for my research question, but after you spoke about it, it's making me much more clear that I have to put these theories that I read already about student veterans and student veterans with disability in higher education in the US.
Okay.
So just,
Okay. Good.
just
I don't want to add.
uh,
Okay, I don't want to add a year to your dissertation writing, but good. I'm glad. That's good. Maram asks, how do you reduce the number of pages? There's no magic formula, Maram. I'm sorry.
I find myself, and I think a lot of people, like writing, and it's hard to decide whether it's important enough to be inside our work or not, because at the end of the process, we are limited by the number of pages.
Yes, we are. And also you're limited by the interest of your reader, right? This is as important as the limit of the number of pages, because again, to give this a phrase of getting lost in the weeds, one thing, let me add one thing to things I said before. And then I'll come back to your question. One of the things you want to do in your writing is to have what I call signposts. Signposts are reminders to the reader what you're doing, because all of a sudden they're in the middle of your empirical analysis and it's going on for pages, right? And they're saying, why am I reading this again? Is this part of the question, part of the answer? I forget, right? So what you need in the middle of, in any article, what you need is internal summaries and transition questions. So you're reminding the reader, okay, our question was such and such, and what we've seen here in this evidence shows that the question is real. You know, I'm not using the language you would use, but you are giving reminders to the reader of what you presented, how it relates to the structure that I gave you, the question, the theoretical question, and the answer, right? And then you want a transition sentence and saying, and now we're going to do such and such. So you don't only have an introduction and conclusion at the beginning and end of the paper, you have internal ones to keep reminding, to keep your reader on track, to keep the reader knowing exactly what you're doing. And again, your writing groups are going to be very important in cutting down pages, because you're right, any dissertation has a lot of information that you can't use. And your friends are going to tell you, your colleagues are going to tell you, no, this is too much, right? You're getting me lost here. Just take this part out. Or this is tangential. It's not really answering your question. It's just something that is related to your question, but it should be in a separate article. So use others to help you determine what's really essential in your writing. Any final questions? This has been such a pleasure for me.
I have a question. Can I ask?
Okay, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Roseanne.
Roseanne, okay.
And I have I want to ask about how do you make the link or the leap between the literature review with the theoretical question that you're asking and the possible answers from the literature, and how do you make this link or leap to your results? Do you give in the answer that you found after the analysis and the results you reached, or do you keep the reader in suspense? Thank you.
Yeah, so what you're doing in that second part of the paper, right? The first part is your empirical question. The second is your theoretical question. You're completing that by saying basically a little summary. Well, we've looked at some possible answers to the question, our question of whatever your question is. And those answers really are inadequate. You've shown us that they're inadequate, right? That they don't work. And then you could say, so now I'm going to turn to my answer, my argument, that will answer this question. So it's a very smooth transition between the rejection of the existing theories and your offering an alternative answer.
Okay, thank you.
Last chance, ladies and gentlemen.
Hi, it's me again.
Okay.
Do you hear me, please?
I-
Can you speak a little bit about the difference between conceptual framework and theoretical framework?
I couldn't quite hear. Could you speak a little louder?
The difference between conceptual framework and theoretical framework.
Conceptual framework and theoretical framework. A conceptual framework, or yeah, I mean, these are just words, but every paper has to be analytic. And by analytic, I mean, it has to ask, why is this like this? How come this is this way? And the reason is that's analytic, and that's your conceptual framework, right? That is the conceptual framework. The theoretical framework, and that question is addressing a broad audience, right? Not just the people interested in your very, very specific, whatever it is, medieval mysticism. But the theoretical question is one that is directed at a very small audience. It's the question of, hey, you know, you people who talk about this and you write about it and you think about it. Well, you know what? You're tripping up here. You're not really answering the question I have asked. That's the theoretical framework, right? So you've got the conceptual, which is your empirical question and your argument, and you've got the theoretical, which is your addressing the conversation of the scientists or humanists who are dealing with your topic.
Thank you. It's very helping. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
And my last question before I say goodbye is, can you give an empirical question example, which is about human, like you said about airplanes and you said about the rivers. Can you say any empirical question in qualitative logic and about people relationship or something, an example like this? Thanks.
Let's see. You mean one that I could just make up off the top of my head? Okay. So let's say, it's not something I deal with all the time. Let's say that we have a family, okay, and and there are two children in the family. One just won a Nobel Prize, and one is in jail, okay? And we want to ask, they grew up in the same family. They had the same environmental conditions. They have pretty much the same genetic makeup, and yet behaviorally, they ended up so different. How come? Why? That's bizarre, okay? That's your empirical question. Now, there can be many answers to that, right? It could be that they grew up in different periods and that the zeitgeist of the different periods affected them differently. One grew up during the Yom Kippur War, and one grew up during the Intifada, and those were entirely different, and you show how. Or you can imagine that, you know, you can think of a lot of answers, and one might say, I think the answer is birth order, right? The birth order literature, right? And you begin to look at that, and that gives you your answer. So it could be at any level. It could be at the human level, the social level. You know, one example I gave, you know, is Palestinians and Zionists started fighting in 1920. They've refused to recognize each other. They engaged in armed conflict. And for years, war after war, attack after attack, suppression after suppression. And then in 1993, they emerged from some secret negotiations and they say, oh, we recognize each other's validity, we give up armed conflict. And you say, well, what happened here? What can possibly explain the about face of both the Palestinian and Israeli leadership? And you can give lots of different answers, right? You can give answers that have to do with the end of the Cold War. You can give answers that have to do with the change in leadership in each of the units. You can have to do with a new generation coming up. There are many, many different answers, right? And you want to try and grasp what the most fundamental answer is, how you can put that together and say something different and original about that.
So if the research is not cause and effect, it's like more about people experiences. You said in the beginning that it's not a how question, it's a why question. But in my study, there's no why, it's how they experience something. So
no, there's a why question there. What's your field?
It's disability studies, and as I said, the experiences of IDF veterans with disabilities in higher education environment, about like accessibility services and so on.
And there's no variance there?
I'm doing a qualitative research, like
doesn't matter. Are they all the same?
Sorry?
Are all the veterans with disabilities, is it all the same, or
No, not the same.
So the differences are your why question. Why do some respond this way and some that way? It's not a how.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Give me a
Thank
footnote.
you for that.
Give me a footnote.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I think we've come to the end, David.
I agree, and I would like to thank you very much for your talk. I got excellent feedback privately, including a wow. She's smiling now, so
it's me.
Thank you very much. This is your second one, and we are very, very grateful. Maybe we can kind of tempt you to do another one, maybe not this, whenever you feel.
I'm always ready.
Excellent. So we will discuss it between ourselves. Thank you, everybody. Great to have you again. I started, there are about 1,500 people on the network. Bring along. We want to have the full 3,000 on our network. So hopefully we have something to do for next year. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.